One Grand Army Plaza, a condominium building in Brooklyn, presents loan exhibitions that are installed in its communal spaces and elevator landings. I'm David Cohen, the current curator of the One Gap Gallery, and this exhibition, Vital Presence, is the first of three in my year-long appointment. Different as Drew Lowenstein, Fran O'Neill, and Fran Shalom are in terms of touch, speed, composition, and so forth, I could see them gelling into an exhibition. I gave each artist predominance in one public space, with a work each by the others to avoid a sense of three separate shows. O'Neill in the lobby, Shalom in the conference room, and Lowenstein in the lounge. Exhibitions here are primarily for the benefit of residents, but offer a chance for artists to be seen by wider communities. And that bonus, alas, has been sacrificed to COVID. As a title, therefore, Vital Presence has a secondary resonance. The artists were even more generous to lend their paintings, given that a bigger audience will likely see the show through this video than will have enjoyed it in situ.
The way I start a painting is when we put a couple of layers of oil priming gesso, and that's to make sure that it has a very smooth surface that can glide. And when I'm putting the paint on, I need it to be able to glide and move.
I work with big brushes, I work with small brushes, I also work with squeegees. Sometimes I might squeegee and put a gestural shape on it very quickly. And then it becomes a process of addition and subtraction, a lot of subtraction ultimately.
The variety of marks that I put together are echoes of each other.
My hands are really my instrument, and that'll extend down to my forearm. And sometimes I'll even try and get a bigger mark. One of the works at the Gap, the big blue and orange one that's in the foyer, really has a mark where I'm using my whole arm extended and my entire body to give that sort of sense of movement and of the monumentality of the mark itself. Just my hand and my arm. I'm not about rolling on my canvases whatsoever. When it comes to the brushes that I use, it varies quite a bit. I would consider primarily my brush itself is more my hand and my arm. But, at different times, I absolutely need to come in with very small brushes.
My shapes are usually very basic. And even though they're very basic, it takes a long time to actually find one that fits. We usually often work in squares. Edges are very important to me. I'm always painting over the painting and taking away the shape, putting another shape on it, changing it up. So it's a process of developing it until it becomes the shape that I want it to be.
Oftentimes they vary by the implement that I'm using, whether I'm using a line, whether I'm using something thicker like a brush stroke. There's very little difference between how I see a line versus a kind of thick, messy brush stroke, because the general kind of shape or feeling within it is to me exactly the same.
The orientation of the work is something that is important to me, but I also say that once it's left the studio, it has a life of its own. And if the owner deems that it's better up left or right, or quarter turn clockwise, so be it. When I am making the work itself, it will inevitably be turned and rotated in the studio multiple times. But I love the idea that a work can have a life of its own, and that you, the viewer, once you actually come into play with it, can actually then decide which way for you it speaks to you. For myself, I have a couple of my own in my house, and they sometimes do demand to be changed, and it can open up the way that I see the image and maybe even give me a different reading. I'm always interested in hopefully being surprised by the work as I make it, and sometimes when I turn the work in particular, that's when that surprise can really be evident to me, because it's sort of like looking at it fresh.
Even a complicated line seems to essentially be made up of a monad of some kind, a sort of reductive, basic flick of the finger, wrist, elbow, or shoulder. The relationship or the conversation or the echo between the larger brush stroke and the precise sort of sharp line. They're in a sense expressing the same angle or whatever it might be.
I never set out to make a humorous painting or a whimsical painting. Somehow it has naturally just come out, whether it's through color, whether it's through something I pull out of the shape. I like humor. It offsets the formality of what I'm painting. I like that balance. It helps to animate what I'm painting. It gives it a life. I have a very intuitive use of color. I have some colors that I gravitate towards. It's relational in that I'll choose a color and then I'll see, well, what would work best next to that or around it or in the figure-ground relationship. And I think it adds a kind of a pop quality to my work, which I like. And yet I don't want it to just be, these bright colors. I want them to work within, with the shape and I do like a figure-ground kind of play back and forth.
A painting is started as a fresh slate, a new piece of fabric. I will sometimes work on raw canvas. I'm always working on the front of that canvas. At some point, I may turn it around, use the back as a new front, in a sense. Some of that might seep through to the other side, which was originally the front. Now, it doesn't matter what side is the front. Whether or not some of it seeps through has to do with whether or not I had decided to gesso. Over time, I'll call them events, conglomerations of shape and form kind of coalesce and then react with one another. That tends to get set up rather quickly, guided by, really feelings. Compositions worked out within the painting as I go along, and I don't do preliminary drawings for paintings anymore. There were times when I used to work a little bit that way.
When I was living in Australia over 20 years ago, and I used to do this particular walk, I would walk to the end of a paddock at sunset, watching the sun setting, and then I would deliberately on the way back not look at the sun setting. And then when I would turn around, it would be an absolute surprise to me, depending on how dramatic the sky was that day. And so to me in my studio, when I'm looking at the work, and especially if I change the orientation of it, I try and step back from the work, walking away from it, not looking at it, turn around from a distance to look at it, to see whether it actually holds that something special, that surprise that I'm really looking for.
I used to be a photographer back before I started painting, and I used to often go to construction sites and I would photograph sculptural things that were, at the beginnings of a building going up. So I was always drawn to shape and form. And I think my forms, my shapes come from how I interact in the world. I love walking down a street and noticing, a shape in the ground or, on the fence or, a piece of cloth. My shapes come from not a deliberate, I want to mimic what I just saw today walking down the street. But I think it really feeds into a vocabulary that I've internalized. I've sometimes looked back at my photographs and there's a definite correlation.
When it comes to working on the scale of the work, the small works can be incredibly informative because they feed directly into the larger works. And that actually was another catalyst for me thinking about the importance of the small and how to potentially get that when you scale up to being mega large, because 12 inches by 12 inches is small for me. And it gets me into that work in a very different way because visually you can see it all at once and you can hold it in your hands and there's a different sense of intimacy. Whereas when you're working on something that's, say, 6 foot square or larger, the intimacy becomes that body canvas relationship, then have the power of the mark be also something that's generating its own sensibilities. And so for me, when I am working small, they become absolutely crucial. And I guess that's where, from this pandemic time, these small works are opening me up in a different way. And I may be pushing the boundaries of what I do on the small scale further than what I even realize. But I guess I'm not going to quite know how that's going to feed in until these next big works do actually show themselves or reveal themselves to me. David, I really can't thank you enough when you wrote to me inviting me into the show. It was really because I was in a bit of a dark stage at that point, trying to work out how I was going to make or how long to wait for any changes that might happen. So having this as something to look forward to is really pretty fantastic for me at the time.